So last year, I made a series of these little clips about the Truman Show because of COVID. One of the little clips I didn't actually end up making was one about context. So I thought I would do a really short clip on the context of the Truman Show. So your rubric for this, and we are doing a close study of literature, and yes, we're doing a film, but in the purpose of the HSC, that is literature, asks us to look at a substantial literary text, and we're looking at it for particular ideas. We're looking for its characteristics, and we're looking at it for its distinctive qualities. And so in order to do that, I think we need to look a little bit at context. And the interesting thing about the Truman Show is that we've got a few contexts happening in there. So we've got the context of Peter Weir as an Australian filmmaker in America. We've got the context of the 1990s, and in particular the late 1990s when this film was made. And then of course you've got your context now. And these contexts, when we look at them, have really interesting roles to play in how we read the text. And with what has happened in our world since this text was made, it actually has a huge impact on what we understand about the text and what the text is doing. So I think it's really important that we look at that and that we address that. So let's really quickly start with Peter Weir. So Peter Weir is a really important Australian filmmaker in the sense that he was part of this thing that we call the Australian New Wave. Well, what does that mean? So at the beginning of the 20th century, Australia had a really huge role to play in filmmaking. We were prolific filmmakers. We made a lot of cinema, cinema that was played internationally, and for various reasons this dwindles and fades away to the point where by the 1950s and the 1960s Australia was making very little in terms of cinema, and any cinema that we are making is not really getting a lot of international attention at all. So by the time we hit the very early 1970s, there's an injection of money. Australia has finally developed for itself an Australian identity, something very separate from Mother Britain. You know, we're not the little sister, the colony anymore. We are a nation in our own right with an identity. And as a consequence of that, Australians want to see their own stories on celluloid. And so Gough Whitlam has a huge role to play in this, as do other Liberal governments, and they start funding Australian cinema. And so by the 1970s, what we end up with is a very exciting period of Australian cinema and filmmakers making Australian stories. Peter Weir is one of them. It also includes filmmakers like Philip Noyce, filmmakers like Bruce Beresford, filmmakers like Gillian Armstrong, and of course, quite famously, George Miller, who is having enormous success with this little film called Mad Max. But Peter Weir is at the forefront of that, and he's come to the forefront with films like Gallipoli, starring, of course, a very young Mel Gibson, films like Picnic at Hanging Rock, which gets huge international attention, and then some really avant-garde stuff like the Cars That Ate Paris. And so these filmmakers, as well as Peter Weir, come to the attention of Hollywood, and they're invited to America to make films. Peter Weir goes to America and he stays in America. So all the subsequent cinema of Peter Weir is American cinema. You know, he's hugely successful with a film called Witness, hugely successful with a little film called The Truman Show, of course, and Green Card and Dead Poets Society, which you've probably watched at some stage in English. So these are only a couple of the films that he makes over there, but they are successful. He ends up with 6 Oscar nominations. He wins 2 BAFTAs. The Truman Show was one of those BAFTA wins. The Truman Show also gets Oscar nominations. So he becomes incredibly successful. So he is an Australian director, but we need to understand that he's an Australian director making films in America. His characteristics, though, crossover. So Peter Weir's films have this real interest in the isolated individual, in the kind of the individual struggling to belong in a society, of an individual that is seeking the truth. So this carries through again into Dead Poets Society, into Witness, and of course The Truman Show, which is really a search for authenticity. we're talking about this Australian director making films in America, though, and we need to understand that The Truman Show, which is the film that we're most concerned with, is an American film, and it responds to the concerns of the late 1990s, which it was made. So we need to look at what on earth is happening in the late 1990s that sees him make this film. I want to start by actually saying that Peter Weir is often credited, because of this film, as kind of being this predictor of the truth, this man who could kind of see the future. And that's not the case. He makes this film, which is a satire. We need to remember that this is a satirical film. And so the satire is responding to important things that are happening in America. So what does America look like in the late 1990s? Well, it's interesting. If you go to some sources, so the New Yorker will report this as well, that America was actually entering a time of quite a lot of optimism, especially moving from the early 90s towards the late 1990s. So there'd been a lot of legislation and policy that was actually seeing the conditions of America's working poor improve. You actually had better outcomes and better opportunities for a lot of people. And when you've got a whole lot of people in society doing better, you get more disposable income, which means that people spend that disposable income on things like entertainment. So the late 1990s becomes this prolific period of production. That is also encompassed with big media, which is a huge thing that gets satirized in our film. So you have things like the internet coming out in the late 1990s, which brings with it a whole lot of digital production, digital photography, digital recording take off in this period. But you also have the birth of satellite television. The Americans tend to call this cable television, which opens up all these networks. So it moves away from just the public networks and the privately owned television stations into this whole arena of cable television. And with all these news outlets, you get this whole burgeoning of new material and new content. So sitcoms are playing across all different kinds of things. And if we go back to the 90s and we look at what people are watching, it's sport, it's sitcoms, and it's entertainment. And so with that entertainment, I'm talking particularly about like entertainment reporting, I'm talking about late night TV shows, all these different kinds, this burgeoning lifestyle production. You get this greater increase of just this digital production that is going on out there, which is very different to what we're looking at in the late 1990s. So behind all this, though, we have kind of 6 big media corporations that are buying this up and they're facilitating it. So I'm talking probably mostly about men like Rupert Murdoch, which I'll talk to you more about in class. But his production, he had been a newspaperman, an Australian newspaperman who acquired a huge global network of media. And then he went on to buy the Fox Entertainment Group, which produced a lot of entertainment. And of course, by 1995, he's acquired this thing called Fox News. Okay, Fox News is still today one of the 5th most watched news programs out there. And it comes with the tagline, fair and balanced. But we need to understand that Rupert Murdoch bought a news organization so he could get his agenda out there. So Fox News is often stacked with Republican reporters, prepared to put out there a Republican agenda. And so we've got this man, very powerful, with a news outlet, with entertainment, production quality and production facilities, who is getting his message out there. So what does that mean when you've got a whole bunch, or a small bunch of powerful men with a lot of control over the media? You have a reason to be concerned, and that concern comes with the fact that these companies have access to production, and they're producing content on a scale that's never been known before, and they have all these outlets and all these channels to reach people. So we have far-reaching media. But what we start to see, and this idea of fake news will not be new to you. It's something that's a very contemporary concern. But in the late 90s, there was less cynicism around the television selling us untruths. But this is something that Peter Weir becomes concerned about, because with entertainment reporting, with more access to tabloid journalism on your television, with this blurring of the lines between news and entertainment, politicians who become celebrities, celebrities who become politicians, there seems to be a real blurring, and this blurring is what Peter Weir becomes concerned with. So I'm going to read you something, a quote of his. You'll have noticed that in all this, I haven't said a word about reality television. I've talked about lifestyle production, but I haven't talked about reality television. And there's a good reason why. It's not that I forgot. What we need to understand is that reality television as we know it didn't exist. This isn't to say there was no reality or actuality programming. It does exist. And it exists all the way back to really the early 1950s. But what you understand, this idea of Big Brother as a reality TV show where a whole bunch of people willingly are filmed with their Monday daily life, doesn't happen until 2000. And then that becomes the prototype for everything you know that follows. And our very contemporary period of reality content is something that's unique to the 21st century. So in 1998, this is what Peter Weir has to say, and this informs very much the film that he made. He said, "My attitude to television personally is too much of it is a bad thing. And it's really at the heart of what the film, The Truman Show, looks at in a major way. The disturbances to our perception of reality as a result of the immense entertainment and actuality coming at us to the point where you can't differentiate anymore. News programs that are entertaining and video everywhere." Okay, and so it's this idea of people not being able to tell truth from reality that starts to concern him. Another really important 1990s context item is, of course, the affair between Bill Clinton and his intern. And it was a very illicit affair that garnered a lot of media attention. But this affair comes to occupy essentially the American imagination, but also the international imagination. And if you can imagine, you have all this content, you have all these channels to display this content. This story is everywhere, and people became less occupied with the truth and more occupied with the scandal of it. And it's everywhere. It's absolutely everywhere. And this idea that you've got all these channels that can report, and a community of people not necessarily asking the right questions about what is true, people not able to discern reality from fiction, that blurring of the lines between what is entertainment and what is news and what is the space in between is really at the heart of the film. Now, I did say we have to consider another context, and that is, of course, our 21st century context. So you've got all this bubbling concern about big media and what big media has the facility to do in the 1990s, and that is at the heart of a satire where a company, a big media company, can adopt a child and exploit that child for entertainment. Well, by the time we get into the 21st century, this doesn't seem so far-fetched. And if you go back to the records, Laura Linney, who plays Meryl in the film, she recalls all the cast and the production crew sitting around laughing as they're filming about how far-fetched this idea is. And in 1998, this idea of the Truman Show does seem far-fetched. It is the concerns of the period taken to their satirical extreme. In the 21st century, and us sitting here watching in 2020, 2021, and 2019, it doesn't actually seem like it could be that far-fetched. We are very accustomed to people filming themselves all the time. We are very accustomed to people watching the mundane play out on their television screen. But I think, and while the film might seem dated in that respect, the film is asking more important questions than ever, because what we see in the audience, and yes, we'll spend a lot of time in Truman's World and we'll talk about Truman, but we have to talk about the audience, because it's the audience that we see. They kind of know that this is a fiction, and yet they can't seem to extract the reality of the situation. So we have a whole group of people who aren't asking critical questions. They're not asking the right questions about what they're consuming, and this becomes the center. And I think in 2021 this concern has currency, and it is something that we should be talking about. So we've got to be really cautious that we don't retrospectively apply everything we know about contemporary contemporary digital media, about contemporary accessibility of content with the film. But that doesn't make the messages in the film any less pertinent. So as you're watching this, I want you to be using that context. Don't get confused about the reality TV, but actually look at what it's satirizing and about the importance of asking critical questions.